Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and any other kind of things that we've done. Really, this week it's just going to be reading. Not a lot of other things have happened. And the reading is a bit interesting. The first thing I want to mention is I got a new bookstore t-shirt. Surprising no one. It's from Montana Book Company. They released these new designs. Somebody called them the loudest bookstore ever, so they decided to lean into it. The air horn is a reference to the protest against their drag story hour during Pride last year. They used an air horn to drown out the sound of the protesters. I love that they incorporated that into a t-shirt, and I love this shirt. Joel has the same thing, but in green. I decided I liked the black and red. But anyway, new bookstore t-shirt, that's all that comes from that. The only other thing to mention just really quickly is reading and stress continued. So don't really want to get into it, but we are waiting for test results for Jamie, and we've been waiting all week. And, you know, the waiting isn't very fun. So we're still waiting to see what's going on there. But I'm sure you can imagine that has led to just general stress and anxiety for both Joel and I. And as a result, I did kind of lean into a bit of comfort reading this week, and I've sort of dragged on anything outside of that. Before we get into the actual Friday Reads portion of the video, I did want to briefly mention, so I had read an ARC of Games and Rituals by Katherine Heiny 3 weeks ago, I don't remember what is time. And that was the week that I had done a lot of cranky reading, and I have wondered ever since if I had gotten irritated with this book because I was cranky. So I sort of picked it up and read one of the stories that had annoyed me 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it didn't annoy me this time. So I didn't reread the whole book, but I think that confirms that it was me, not the book. Because it was more funny and amusing and observant. So I just wanted to mention that so I could be a little more fair to something I read when I was cranky about other things. So, and then let's just go into the Friday Reads portion of this video. You know, dive right in. So, I am still working on my physical book, which is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Joel finished. We were reading this book together. And so, he's done. He was listening to it on audio, and he had to finish because it was going to be returned. And he was traveling that week anyway. So, he managed to put in a good push and finished it, and now he's waiting on me. And I'm sorry, but I'm reading the book, and I'm just kind of stuck. I'm in the same chapter I think I was in I'm on chapter 16. I can't remember where I was last week, but I'm like in the middle of chapter 16. And I think I started that chapter, got like halfway through it, and stopped over the weekend and have made no progress since. So I really need to get back to this. Not just because Joel is done, but because I really do want to finish this book. And I was enjoying it. It's just, I find when I pick it up, because, you know, stress and anxiety, I've been less able to focus. My attention has been much better focused on audiobooks right now. And I think part of it is that this book is such an active reading experience, because since I'm doing it for my Pulitzer Prize project, I'm taking notes and noting things down and trying to mark repetitions of things and recurrence of themes and all that kind of thing. So it requires a lot of thought and attention. And at the moment, I've been a little bit struggling with that. I'm sure you can understand. But I really do want to pick this back up, hopefully this weekend. I don't think we have anything really planned this weekend, so hopefully there will be a good morning where I can pick this up and get a good chunk through. It is really cold where we live. I should mention that. It's cold in a lot of places in the United States right now, but it is freezing where we are. The low temperatures have gotten below -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's cold. It's really cold. So Jamie is also bored out of her mind, because obviously we haven't really been taking her for walks because it's sort of dangerously cold outside. And we've taken her for drives to try to get her some excitement, but it's not the same thing. So you know, what can you, all you can do is get through it. But yeah, so that's been going on, and it hasn't been fun. But since it's going to be cold again this weekend, maybe that'll be a good time to curl up on the couch with Jamie and Joel and a nice little blanket and a cup of coffee and try to get some more progress in this, because I'm less than halfway through. Although there are a lot of notes at the end of this book. Actually, not as many as I thought. Never mind. Take that back. I think there are actually more notes before the book than there are, so that would work against me rather than for me, but it doesn't matter. Point just being, I really need to get back to this book. I was really enjoying it, and I am gonna get my Pulitzer Project for this going. So that's all to come. I should mention quickly a book I started and did not finish. I had started the audio of The Job by Sinclair Lewis and did not get very far. So I'm mentioning it here, but this is not something that I would even count as a DNF. So if you're new or if you need a reminder, my general rule is that if I'm reading a physical book, I don't really count myself as reading it until I get at least 50 pages in. And sometimes in longer books, I don't really count it as something I've been reading until I'm about 100 pages in. So this is less than 500 pages. I think 500 pages is sort of the threshold where I need to be about 100 pages in. Anything less than that, 50 pages is fine. So if I don't meet that threshold, I don't consider it a book I've DNF'd if I stop reading. I consider it something I tried, didn't get along with, and that's it. And my threshold for audiobooks is kind of arbitrary. I decided 15% because I don't really know what the equivalent of 50 pages or 100 pages would be. 15% just seemed like a good place. And again, it really depends on the length of the book. But point just being, I didn't even make it 15% of the way into this book. So I'm mentioning it here, but the reality is this is not something that I'm going to count on like my worst books of the year. It's not even going to appear on lists of things that I read. You won't hear about it in my February reading wrap up when Joel and I film that next week. I just want to put it out there because it's interesting. The reason I picked it up is because I am working on my Pulitzer Prize deep dive for His Family by Ernest Poole, which I did not grab. Let me grab my Franklin Library edition of it. It's right here. And pretty. So I finished this. I've been working on my Pulitzer Prize deep dive of it. And part of that involves looking at books that were published in 1917. And I've actually been having a really good time doing that. If you remember, last week I was really excited about Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber because I read that and I just loved it. Summer by Edith Wharton, I read it and loved it. Turns out 1917 is a really interesting year in publishing. So I've kind of been holding my deep dive on His Family to get a little bit of, dig my feet into what the publishing year of 1917 was. It's sort of an arbitrary thing that I have done to myself for no real reason other than that I find it interesting. Here is, by the way, the opening illustration for His Family in the Franklin Library edition. So I'll stop torturing you with my Franklin Library edition. I'm just obsessed with them. So this is part of that. Sinclair Lewis actually published 2 books in 1917. The other one is much shorter. It was referred to as a pulp novel. It's called The Innocents. And the audio of that is available on Scribd. By the way, the interesting thing about 1917 is not just that there are interesting books that were published that year, it's because it's so long ago at this point that these books don't have copyrights. So you can find companies that created audiobooks of it and put them online, or put PDFs of the book online, and some interesting things like that. So this was part of that, and I really did not like it. Maybe if I had read it before Fanny Herself, it wouldn't have triggered this immediate reaction of like, oh, this is garbage from me. But it kind of feels like reading a political pamphlet disguised as a novel, and I really was not into that. And it's particularly funny, again, having just finished reading Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber, because this book is sort of a political treatise about the suffrage movement and a woman's place in the world. And it's funny, I'm going to refer to a copy of the image of the first edition of the book, which I'm going to put here for you, but I need to read, because you might not be able to read what's in the corner, but what it says is, perhaps the first novel to give the real day-to-day life of women on the job in the world of offices and in love. Which, again, like, they were published the same year, so it's not like that's a way of denying the existence of Fanny herself. However, Fanny herself did all of those things, and better. It wasn't like just constantly being nudged by the author, like, hey, hey, hey. Like, within the first 10 pages, the protagonist of The Job thinks to herself, oh, if only I were a boy, then this would be so much easier. And it's just like, okay. You're being really blunt. I get it. So I just figured, you know what? I'm not going to get anything out of this. So I stopped reading it. And I had originally been thinking about reading 2 other books that were published that year and have PDFs online. And I think I'm going to let them go and just film my deep dive on his family at this point, because I don't think there's really much else to get in terms of perspective. And they are available online. One is Bromley Neighborhood by Alice Brown, which was the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize alongside his family, and obviously his family won. And another book is called 3 Black Pennies by Joseph Hergesheimer. And part of what would have been interesting about the Hergesheimer book in particular is that in one of the early years of the prize, I think it was the 3rd year of the prize, I'm looking at my list, and yes, it was the 3rd year, they did not have a winner for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And the reason is that there was a dispute over the wording in the mandate for the Pulitzer Prize at the time, which included the word wholesome, and the book that had been recommended for the prize, which was by Joseph Hergesheimer. It's a different book, but so he is part of the Pulitzer lore already. So the fact that he released a book this year was just interesting to me. So I think I'm going to give myself a little time and grace to not have to wade into old PDFs that I can only really properly read on my laptop, and just focus on The Grapes of Wrath instead. So I let the job go. And again, it's not going to show up in my February wrap-up. It's not going to show up in my worst books of the year, because I didn't get far enough into it to really adequately judge. Maybe it calms down a little bit once the book actually gets going. But I felt like I got everything that the book was going to try to give me from Fanny herself, and probably way, way, way better. So I let that one go. And that's when I started on other paths in audio. And I really decided to lean into sort of comfort listening and things that are going to make me happy. The first one I went to is Christmas Past, The Fascinating Stories Behind Our Favorite Holiday Traditions by Brian Earl. This comes from a podcast and definitely feels like it came from a podcast, to be honest. It is interesting and has a lot of fun stories. It's also short. The audio, I think, is only about 4.5 hours. So if you even speed it up slightly, I don't like to speed things up very much, but I think at 1.2 or 1.3 speed, it was 3 hours. So I got through it very quickly. It did everything I needed it to do. It sort of calmed me, entertained me, gave me some interesting facts. And that's what I was looking for. And that is what it did. And I know we're almost in March, so people probably don't want to hear a lot about the holidays. I'll leave it alone. But just, hopefully you understand. The holidays give me comfort. And in this sort of stressful, anxious period that Joel and I have found ourselves in, it definitely helped calm me. And then when I was finishing that book, I was actually chatting with Doris from Aldi Books, just about books. And I was trying to think of other books that would sort of help calm me. And I reached out to her actually because she had said that she was going to be starting lessons in chemistry in one of her videos. So I was asking her if she had started it yet, and she had not. And she recommended something that she had recently finished, which is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. And I will admit, I've heard good things about this book in other places from other people, even people who say that they're not really into fantasy. Like me, I don't really read a lot of fantasy. But I've kind of ignored it a little bit, to be honest. And Doris did a video that she got me like this far away from being interested in reading it. And she kind of said to me, it's like, that would actually be the perfect book for where you're at right now. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And I actually did like it. It was the perfect book. Doris was right. It was the perfect book for where I have been at mentally, emotionally, and everything. So if you're unfamiliar, Legends and Lattes plays with sort of fantasy tropes, like you might find in, say, Dungeons and Dragons. The protagonist of the book is named Viv, and she is an orc. And there are gnomes and elves, and there's magic and all that kind of stuff. However, if you are not into those things, it's a very approachable book. It almost uses the different races and species and things like that as a sort of code for differences that people might not accept. So it almost feels like a queer book that's not named as a queer book. There are actually queer elements of the book that don't want to spoil anything, but it's kind of like coded in that element where you need to find your own home, maybe your chosen family, and ways of making your way in the world, despite what people might have in terms of preconceptions and things like that. So Viv is sort of an adventurer. Again, kind of think Dungeons and Dragons, which, by the way, not to make it sound like I completely denigrate fantasy. I do enjoy fantasy. I just don't read a lot of it. And I struggle to find versions of it that I like. And I did briefly play Dungeons and Dragons in high school. I think by the time I was in college, I had moved away and didn't do it anymore. But so I have a past. I have a background for that. It's not like I'm just opposed to fantasy. I don't want you to think that. But anyway, so Viv has been sort of adventuring and going on quests and things like that, and she's tired of it. So she hangs up her sword, and literally, actually, she uses it as decoration in her coffee shop, which she opens. And in this book, coffee is sort of a gnomish invention that people really aren't familiar with. So she is opening a shop for a product that people don't really know. And in the process of doing this, she sort of finds a community of friends and people and allies, and to sort of, again, a chosen family. And it's actually a really beautiful and sweet book. I did very much appreciate the fact that in books like this, a lot of the time, even though the plot itself is sort of quiet, it will build to something that is very high stakes. And there are high stakes in the ending. I don't want you to think nothing happens in this book. But it doesn't force in a plot about some world-ending thing that will force the character to fight or anything like that. It's much more interesting than that in some ways. I mean, that can be fun. It can be done well, but it also gets a little tiresome. And I think that's one of my problems with Marvel movies and things like that. You can't have small stakes. Everything has to be the universe is in peril. And I really thought this was a cute book. Doris knocked it out of the park. It was everything that I needed. Again, that was not necessarily a Christmas book and not an overt queer romance. I almost did listen to one of those, and I might still, because I did start another audio, which we'll get to in a moment. And I think I'm going to need comfort audio listening for a little bit, and I'm just going to try to lean into that a little bit. Once we have test results for Jamie and we know what we're dealing with, then maybe I can think about something a little more hardcore in terms of a book. But in theory, I'm working on something more serious in physical book form. So audio has become sort of an escape right now. So I finished that. And just yesterday, I started the book Oscar Wars, A History of Hollywood in Gold, Sweat, and Tears by Michael Schulman. I don't think it surprises anyone that I was interested in this book. I talked about it in my most anticipated books of 2023, which came really late this year, but I'll link it in the description box down below if you haven't seen it yet. And I started it. I will say the book was marketed to me as being using sort of case studies from each decade of the Academy, sort of controversies and campaign stories and things like that, to talk about the Academy as a whole and the evolution of the cinema industry as a whole. And so I was hooked into it because, obviously I was hooked into it because of the Oscars, and that's a particular interest of mine. But I was also hooked into it because there was the idea of this sort of lurid idea of using the controversies as a hook and using them as sort of case studies for larger things. And it's actually a lot drier than that, to be honest. It is probably the driest history of the Academy that I have read, and I've read a couple. However, it is also the most extensive and thorough history of the Academy that I've ever read, and I do really appreciate that. So it's not quite what I was expecting, because I was expecting something that was going to be a little more sensational and therefore kind of fitting for where I'm at mentally and emotionally right now. And it is a little dry, just a little dry. However, I'm really interested in this topic, so it's working for me. It's working just fine for me, actually. It's a long book. I think I am 16 or 17% of the way into it right now, and it's going to be just fine because I'm really interested in this topic. So it's going to do just fine. And then when I'm done with that, I might sort of dive into a queer romance or something like that. I tend to be a mood reader, so I have a couple of days of dealing with Oscar wars, and when I'm done, I'll be ready to decide what my next audio is going to be. In terms of Library Apocalypse, one more thing got thrown on my plate, and I think actually tomorrow morning, if we sit with Jamie and some coffee, I am going to do this one first. This was not on my library pile in my last Friday Reads video, which I will link down below as well. This is Selected Poems by Gwendolyn Brooks. And it's a tiny little thing. It is only 137 pages, and that includes a section about Gwendolyn Brooks. This is something that I want to read for a couple of reasons. First, I don't do a lot of poetry, and I kind of periodically want to challenge myself to do more poetry. So there's that angle. Also, there's a prompt on the Montana Book Company's reading challenge to read a book of poetry by a poet you haven't read before. There are a lot of poets that I haven't read before. Erica from The Broken Spine actually mentioned Gwendolyn Brooks to me, and while we were talking about it, I looked her up, and Gwendolyn Brooks is the first Black author to win a Pulitzer Prize. Not in fiction, in poetry, but still, there's that sort of connection to my Pulitzer Prize project. It's not fiction, but it's poetry, but still, that I find really interesting. And obviously, it is Black History Month, and I want to do something that would be interesting for Black History Month, so this would fit in under the wire and get in there. I do think, ideally, in a perfect world, people should not just use Black History Month to read books by Black authors or about Black history, but I do think it's also really important to participate in it and to actively discover new Black authors, new Black stories, and new histories, or just, it doesn't have to be new, because there are a lot of topics that have been covered, but maybe you want to learn more about them, things like that. So, think about how I use Pride Month to read nothing but LGBTQ plus authors. It doesn't mean I don't read them in other months, but I do put that focus on it. And I really wanted to do something that would participate in Black History Month. So this will be that. And it will also meet a prompt for the Montana Book Company's Reading Challenge. And it's also somebody who is a really interesting figure that I will be happy to get to know a little bit better. So that will be tomorrow morning, and then I'll pivot and get back to The Grapes of Wrath. That, I think, is everything that I have had going on this week. I would love to hear what you've been up to, what you've been watching, reading, loving. We didn't really manage to watch any new Oscar movies this week, except for Causeway, which is nominated for Best Supporting Actor for Brian Tyree Henry. He was really good, and so was Jennifer Lawrence in that movie. It was very slow, but I appreciated it. It really allowed you to sort of get into the tone of the characters and what they were experiencing. That is on Apple TV, if you would like to check it out. That's the only one we got to watch. So let me know what you've been reading, what you've been watching, and any of that stuff in the comment section down below, as well as if you have thoughts on anything I have talked about here. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.